Before we get into our last way to describe a relationship between two variables, I wanted to give you extra practice and another example of writing a verbal rule. Let's take a look at this situation. Have you ever wondered why your take-home pay is much lower than your gross pay? Most middle-class Americans experience a 32% reduction from their gross pay due to taxes, Social Security, retirement deductions, and other stuff. So you may verify that on your next paycheck, but the deduction amount from each paycheck depends on the amount of the gross pay of that paycheck. So in order to write a verbal rule, you have to identify the variables that are involved in the situation. So when you read this, you may think, well, that take-home pay is a variable. I mean, that could change depending on how much you work and whatnot. Your gross pay, same way, is another variable here. 32% reduction is a constant here for us. It's not changing. Most middle-class Americans, and we're assuming most, will experience that. But this statement here, this last statement, really identifies outright what the variables are, and it focuses on this phrase here, depends on. So this quantity depends on this quantity, and whenever you see that phrase there, your variables are identified for you. So we got two here. There's the deduction amount, meaning how much is taken out of the paycheck, and then there's the gross pay. So there's my two variables, and one question we will ask you is which is the input variable and which is the output. And the nice thing about this statement here is it kind of defines it for us as well. The output variable will always depend on the input variable, and so when you're calculating stuff, the input variable is what you would consider first. So this outright says, hey, the deduction amount depends on this. So this is your output variable and this is your input. So in other words, you'd have to know this first to get a calculation for that down. So this is our output variable and this is our input. And just for the sake of writing a verbal rule, I'm going to write a letter here. Let's let D be the deduction amount and G be the gross pay. Okay, so here's what a verbal rule, here's what we're asking for you to write. Write a verbal rule that describes how to calculate the deduction amount given a gross pay amount. Now you may say, Aaron, those variables are outlined for us right there too, so that's nice, but often they're not, so you kind of have to have a method of identifying the variables. But a verbal rule is simply that. It's a word description that tells us how to calculate output values, so our deduction amount. So let's go figure out how that is done first. In a table format, the input goes first, then it's the output. So gross pay amounts up here and deduction amounts here. So let's do 1,500. So let's say our gross pay is 1,500 before taxes and all this stuff. But when this is applied, you're going to get reduced by 32%. So what amount would be 32% of that? So hopefully you're thinking multiply. So let's take 1,500 and multiply it and hit it with 32%. The idea is that 480 will be taken out. 480. So that's the deduction amount. Now the take-home pay is the third variable we're not interested in, is the difference between those two. So, but just so you know, these are variables here. Let's say, I don't know, 1870 is the gross pay amount. So you would take 1870 and multiply it with 32%. And that right there is what's going to get taken out, 598.40. So again, you should probably verify this in your next paycheck and see if it actually is around 32%. So there's at least a couple of values to help us write how to describe, write a description of how to calculate the deduction amounts. So what did we do to calculate this? So that's what we're after here. So the deduction amount is calculated by What did we to get these values? Well, we took our gross pays and multiplied them with 0.32. So we just need to write that. Calculated by multiplying the gross pay by 0.32. So that's our verbal rule for this situation.